Somehow I can never get away from the Four Noble Truths, the three characteristics of existence, and Dukkha. And it sort of came up this time around because in our Friday Women's Restoration and Rejuvenation group, just about everyone sharing was having difficulty in their lives. And in these times, we see over and over again everyone talking about these difficult times we're in and how to manage them and what happens to us, emotionally. And it always brings me back to the Four Noble Truths, that it's the structure that the entire teaching of the Buddha, containing its principles, there's just an example of the elephant's footprint is so large that all the other animals' footprints can fit within it. It's that the truths, the Four Noble Truths resolve is that dukkha is present, and it's everything is within this elephant's footprint. The Pali word, the simple version of the Pali word, it simply meant pain and suffering. And it's a meaning that is in many of the texts when it's also used as a quality of feeling. Sometimes it's been rendered as pain or painful. And the first noble truth of dukkha has a wider significance. It's more of a reflection of a whole philosophical vision in a way. I mean, it draws from the connection of pain and suffering, including, but there's also this inherent unsatisfactoriness of everything that is conditioned. And the unsatisfactoriness of the condition is due to the fact that it's impermanent. And, the vulnerability to pain and the inability to provide complete and lasting happiness. And this notion of impermanence, anicca, which we see clearly in our practice when we're bringing our minds back to the present moment, it forms the bedrock. It's the very basis of the Buddha's teaching. It was the initial insight that impelled him to leave his palace in search of a path to enlightenment. That impermanence in the Buddhist view comprises all conditioned existence, from, the cosmic to the microscopic. And at the far end of the spectrum, the Buddha's vision reveals a universe of immense dimensions, evolving and disintegrating in repetitive cycles throughout beginningless time. He would always veer away from questions that were esoteric because there was never an end to be found. And then in the middle range of that teaching, that the mark of impermanence comes to manifest our inescapable mortality. We're bound to aging. We're bound to sickness and death. And possessing this body that's worn, and as it's said in the teachings, to being worn and rubbed away to dissolution and disintegration. And at the close end of that spectrum, the Buddha's teaching discloses the radical impermanence uncovered by uncovered only by sustained attention to experience in this very moment. It's living immediacy, the fact that all constituents of our being, bodily, mental, they're in a constant process, arising and passing away, in rapid succession, moment to moment, without any persistent underlying substance, nothing to really hang on to. It's the very act of observation while we're watching them that they undergo destruction, vanishing, fading away, and ceasing, as the Buddha talked about it. And this characteristic of impermanence that marks everything conditioned, everything is conditioned, that it comes into our senses. And his guidance is toward the unconditioned. But he noticed the universality of dukkha and suffering. And there's this all-pervasive aspect of dukkha in the explanation of that first noble truth when he talks about the 5 aggregates that are affected by clinging and therefore suffering. The 5 aggregates are a way of classifying that the Buddha had devised for demonstrating the composite nature of our personality. And that scheme really comprises every possible type of conditioned state. And it's divided into the 5 aggregates: material form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. So the aggregate of the material form, rupa, includes the physical body with its sense faculties, as well as external material objects. That's the material form. And the aggregate of feeling, or vedana, is the affective element in experience, either pleasant or painful or neutral. So when we're watching things arise and pass away, and we notice the feeling tone, it's pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And then perception, which is sanna, that's the 3rd aggregate. It's the factor that's responsible for noting the quality of things and also accounting for recognition and memory. So it's how we perceive through our recognition and our memory. The formation aggregate of sankhara, that's the 4th one, is a term that includes all volition, emotive, cognitive aspects of the mental life. And then there's consciousness, vijnana, the 5th aggregate, and it's the basic awareness of an object indispensable to all cognition. Well, Sariputta shows this analysis of the First Noble Truth and represents all 5 of the aggregates, talking about experience arising in a connection with each of the 6 senses and the faculties and their objects. So everything that comes to us comes through our senses, and we sort of solidify it through these aggregates. But as we look at each of these parts of ourself, we find that there's really nothing that we can cling to. And so the Buddha's statement that the 5 aggregates themselves are dukkha, these 5 aggregates that make up our body, our perceptions, our feeling, our consciousness, that we can't hang on to it, and it creates, that they themselves are dukkha. And so the very things that we identify with and we hold to as the basis for our happiness, rightly seen, are the basis for the suffering that we dread. And even when we feel ourselves comfortable and secure, the instability of the aggregates is itself a source of oppression, and it keeps us perpetually exposed to suffering in its more blatant forms. And so the whole situation becomes multiplied further to dimensions beyond what we can calculate when we take into account the Buddha's disclosure of the fact of rebirth. So all beings in whom ignorance and craving remain present wander on in the life of repeated existence, or samsara. And each in turn brings suffering and the new birth and aging and illness and death. So life in any world is unstable, and there's no shelter and no protector and nothing to hang on to. And so it's really tied up with impermanence and suffering, where we can begin to see a characteristic of not self. And even though that sounds really scary, and it's usually particularly scary in like a psychological sense, but when we see that there's nothing to cling to and there's not a self, there actually can be a great joy in that. One of my teachers talks about the analogy of a parachute, that a person is jumping out of an airplane and they've got their parachute and they pull the first line and the parachute doesn't open. And then they're free falling and they pull the second line for the emergency and it doesn't open either. But there's falling and never a ground. There's no ground to hit. So even when we're in the midst of our most suffering, if we can clearly see that there's nothing to hang on to, the ground just continues falling away, there is a great joy and openness in that. And, sometimes it's kind of hard when we're thinking about impermanence and non-self and dukkha and all of that. Well, what do we do about it? Or, how can I see this clearly? And so, mainly if we just continue taking time every day to sit down, even for just a few minutes, and practice detailed awareness about the workings of the mind, and just practice awareness. It's sophisticated, it's a skill that takes time to learn, but even our initial efforts can yield benefits. I'm sure we've seen this. It's a familiar ground for, meditators, but it's worth re-examining, just starting over for a few minutes, not being hard on yourself for however long you sit, and gently relinquishing our thoughts that lead us to dukkha, just gently letting go the suffering and the unhappiness and the stress, and allow ourselves to open to and to welcome thoughts that lead to happiness. And ultimately, it's patience that's involved, and practicing in the company of others like we do when we sit together. And we can have this feeling of containment of the Sangha supporting us. The Sangha has supported for thousands of years, 2,600 years. And we have the blessing and acknowledgement of the teachings and the understanding that there is freedom, that awakening is possible. And we see it clearly by really acknowledging dukkha, by really seeing what it is that we attach to that causes us to not be able to let go of the unskillful. So that's probably all I need to say, and I think we should let these words settle down because that was a lot of words. There is something I'd like to share. If we can understand it or not, I'm going to look up this video that's on Sayadaw U Tejaniya's website that's called Understanding Dukkha is Freedom. So I'm going to see if I can find it.